Hello. Today we are going to talk about case studies and testimonials, and in particular focus on the distinction between the two. Case studies are an important part of psychological research, but we also have to be very cautious in the kinds of things we consider case studies versus what we would call a testimonial. And a testimonial is not scientific and generally offered up by someone who has purchased something and says they like it, that sort of thing. Recommendations from friends, that kind of thing. Now, let's start with a quick introduction to case studies. These are intensive description and analyses of individuals or a couple of individuals. Probably one of the most sort of classic collections of case studies is Oliver Sacks' book, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, which are really well-written, interesting discussions of individuals with various brain disorders that we're going to talk about, that I talk about in other classes, I should say. So those are written by scientists. And usually these are individuals with unusual injuries or disorders that have something distinctive to offer to science. Oftentimes these are also written up as treatments. Particularly, oftentimes you'll see case studies written up for emergency treatments from emergency room visits, which can then be taken on to treat larger experimental designs. Certainly we're seeing a lot of that with the COVID-19, people trying out treatments, but not in a systematic way that then have to be subjected to systematic scrutiny. And we're starting to see that some of that systematic scrutiny shows that some of the potential treatments probably aren't as effective as we might have hoped. Testimonial is quite different from a case study. They're usually given by the person taking a treatment themselves. It's the person who, lost 15 pounds on Weight Watchers and now they feel great. And so people then go to Weight Watchers because Maria Osmond goes to Weight Watchers. Testimonials are an important problem, I should say, that we are going to spend some time talking about when we get towards the end of this particular talk. But I want to first talk about some famous case studies, give you a flavor of the kinds of things that we're talking about. Certainly one of the earliest and most famous case studies in psychology comes from Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage was a railroad worker who was injured in an accident where this tamping rod you see him holding went up through his left orbital bone and out the top of his head. As you can see, he lost his left eye. On the left side here, you can see some modern reconstructions of Gage's injury using his skull, which you can see down here at the bottom, to reconstruct what the likely path of injury was and examine the loss of connections. This is from a book called Descartes' Error, where the Damasio's, Hannah and Antonio Damasio, take a look at Gage's injuries and talk about what it can tell us about the neuropsychology of decision-making. Henry Molaison, another very famous case study for most of my career, was known as patient HM. He passed away, I want to say in 2008, 2009, somewhere in there. In the 1950s, I think it was 1959, might have been earlier. I should check my notes before I do these things. Earlier in the 50s, let's put it that way, Henry had significant seizure disorder, and so underwent neurosurgery and had pretty significant sections of his hippocampi and medial temporal lobe structures removed to treat his temporal lobe epilepsy. Unfortunately, for patient HM, this resulted in very dense anterograde amnesia. He essentially didn't remember anything that followed that surgery in the 1950s. So he lived about 50 years with very little, in fact, almost no conscious memory of the previous 50 years. And this is an incredible case study, completely revolutionized the way we understand memory. Everything that we've learned about this particular case study has been followed up with experiments with normal participants, with other amnesic patients, and some of my research, we've used the drug Versed or midazolam to induce amnesia and look at some of the patterns of functioning for patient HM. And so lots of great psychological research stemming from this particular case study. Now, I do want to note there are some case studies that have turned out to be rather fictionalized. So Sybil was supposed to be the true story of an individual with multiple personality disorders. That has since been demonstrated to have been false. Essentially, she was coached. The entire story is fictional. And the same with the Three Faces of Eve was supposed to have been a true story, but in fact, actually it was not. In fact, there are a lot of people who don't believe that there really is any such disorder as multiple personalities. It would be called dissociative personality disorder at this point. So beware that not everything might be what it seems. So some advantages of case studies. These provide some sources of ideas about behavior. They provide opportunities for clinical innovation. Certainly for clinical psychologists who might want to try something new. This provides a potential way to treat individuals. And you see, I've seen a lot of different kinds of clinical innovations that sort of come and go, that work and don't work depending on once they've been scaled up. But there is certainly some interesting case studies involved. And case studies have provided us with a lot of really important information, so about things like language development, that sort of thing. Some of these kids who, not very many, but there have been some case studies with kids who basically had no exposure to language and then really never develop any sort of linguistic structure ever. And so there are some really important things we can look at with these kind of rare phenomena. These allow us to challenge theoretical assumptions. So, for example, with those kids, if they'd been able to learn language, it would have challenged the assumption that you learn language as children mostly. Certainly, the case of Henry Molaison allowed us to have a far better understanding of how memory works and to develop systems use of memory. So provides that kind of tentative support for different theoretical explanations of phenomena. In my cognitive neuroscience class and in my cognition class, I spent a great deal of time actually talking about different case studies involving visual perception disorders and what they can tell us about the process by which we recognize objects every day. And so they can provide us some really important theories. I finally want to end up with a quick note about the different kinds of approaches we've talked about. A nomothetic approach is one which is based on sort of large numbers, so large experiments that we would have talked about previously, versus an idiographic approach is one in which we're talking about individuals. If you think about things like the word idiosyncratic, kind of the same idea. We're looking at individuals and trying to understand individual differences, and both have important places in development of psychological theory. Some disadvantages: these are very difficult for us to establish causality because we don't have, it's not an experiment. We're pretty sure patient HM's memory loss was due to the loss of his hippocampi and medial temporal lobes, but of course it's difficult to establish that kind of causality without experiments, which is why we follow these up with experiments. There's also the potential for bias, particularly with therapeutic interventions. People see their patients getting better because they want them to get better. They want it to work. The patients want it to work, that sort of thing. Obviously, big problems with generalization. We don't know if one case study is going to generalize to the rest of the population or not. So these are obviously some problems. Some appropriate uses for case studies: we can use them as a starting point for our scientific investigations. They launch us off oftentimes into important directions. And the neuropsychology literature is rife with some really amazing examples. So we discovered, for example, area MT, which is responsible for our perception of movement, because there are very rare instances of individuals who can no longer perceive movement. So they provide us with a good starting point. An appropriate case study will be an unbiased, thorough reporting of a case, no details left out, and without any bias from the researcher or the therapist, always including the appropriate caveats. Remember, this is a single case study, might not generalize. We can't prove that this is a causal relationship. And these unusual cases provide us with really important converging evidence and oftentimes very important insights, particularly patient HM, but not conclusions. So we have to back these up with further investigations and further study. And that's what's really important about things like clinical innovation is we need to determine whether or not they're actually genuine or statistical artifacts. So, for example, there have been a few cases using some HIV medications, some of the older classes of HIV medications to try to treat COVID-19, in particular what are called protease inhibitors. And the problem with those studies is they're given to individuals. The individual gets better, but we don't know if it was the drug or if the individual might have gotten better on their own because we don't have an appropriate placebo control. One of the other problems we're seeing with a number of more recent studies is there is the possibility that the sickest patients are getting some treatments. And so we have to try to figure out more systematically how to treat patients. Problems, of course, we're in the middle of an emergency. And so as somebody said the other day, I think it was Governor Polis here in Colorado, that said essentially what we're doing right now with this disease is we're trying to design a car, build it, and drive it all at the same time. And that's difficult. So that gets us now to thinking about testimonials. Case studies are thorough investigations by an individual scientist, but a testimonial is given by the patient or a subject themselves. Not hard to find testimonials. They are everywhere. Late night TV is full of them. Your Facebook feed is full of them. All kinds of people trying to tout the benefits of this, that, or the other thing. And this is a problem because these are not scientific investigations. Oftentimes this is mere hucksterism. I'm not saying apple cider vinegar doesn't work or doesn't. I don't know. Could. I'm not drinking it. Gross. But I know people swear by a number of things. Oftentimes they're just placebos. The first thing we always want to keep in mind is celebrity endorsements are not science. So particularly these quacks. Remember that people like Dr. Phil and Dr. Oz have sponsors, and oftentimes those sponsors are the individuals paying to have their products touted on his show. So we have to really be cautious of that. And Dr. Phil, don't get me started on him. So probably shouldn't listen to these two, particularly when we're talking about virology, other kinds of diseases, or treatments. So remember, we want to talk about science. We're not talking about other celebrity endorsements, etc. We talked about the bandwagon fallacy long ago in class, and this fits right in with that. So here's where we get down to why testimonials are such a problem. We'll start with placebo effects and the cost of goods. Well, first of all, people often get better or improve because they believe something worked. Basic placebo effect, it's the reason why we do placebo-controlled designs. The more expensive a treatment is, the more likely people are to think it has worked. There is lots of research in this area. If you tell someone a placebo costs 10 cents a pill or $1 a pill, the $1 a pill placebo will relieve their headache much better than the 10 cent a pill, even though they're both the same thing. This becomes particularly problematic when we're talking about things like workout supplements and diet supplements, in that people have what we call sunk costs. So when you drop, a full bill on workout supplements, $100, then you're probably going to go to the gym more, or you're going to change your diet. So people who invest a lot of money in workout supplements, diet supplements, are oftentimes changing a lot of other things in their life at the same time, but they're going to attribute everything to that supplement, the magic of the supplement. We are people who engage in a lot of magical thinking, and believing that supplement is going to help is a big part of that. One thing to be sure is a lot of workout supplements have the potential to be very dangerous, particularly those pre-workouts. They have a lot of caffeine in them. So you add that on top of your venti pike that you had in the morning, and then toss a Red Bull on top of that, and it really sets you up for a potential for heart difficulties. So I want to stop for a second. It's really funny. My TV's on in front of me, and right now Susie Wargin is touting the benefits of some kind of windows, like she's a window expert. So speaking of testimonials, they're on TV right now. So watch out, is what I'm going to say. And your friends will be just as big a testimonial as anybody else. They'll swear something works when it usually doesn't. Next issue with testimonials is vividness and the impact of a single case. Amos Tversky and Dan Kahneman, in their really phenomenal research back in the 1970s, found that people use an availability heuristic to guide their decision-making. This is the work Dan Kahneman won the Nobel Prize for. Amos Tversky had already passed, unfortunately. So this availability heuristic is where people base their decisions on the things that are most memorable, the things that they remember best because they're most available in memory. And this can result in a dramatic misperception of risk, because we tend to remember the most vivid things imaginable. These are often single cases or unusual cases, and they are the most persuasive because they put a face on a tragedy. So people remember plane crashes and are afraid to fly. But the fact is, the most dangerous thing you do when you fly, or it used to be anyway, is getting in a car and driving to the airport is the most dangerous part of that whole experience. Similarly, one of the things I talk about in many of my classes is the danger associated with living in the city versus living in the suburbs. People often think of the city as being more dangerous because on the nightly news, there will be news of people being shot and killed in the city. The problem is that's really unlikely to happen. What's far more likely to happen is that you'll die in a car accident. And so the more you drive every day, the more likely you are to die at an early age. But these single cases are often quite persuasive. And that's the reason why we have this modern fear of kids being kidnapped. It's because people like Nancy Grace sensationalize these individual cases. And in fact, most people have no idea who the most likely kidnapping victim is. And in fact, African-American girls around age 13 are the most likely kidnapping victim. They're not white kids from the suburbs, but inner city kids are the most likely ones to disappear, particularly about 13 years old and African American. But you would never know that by watching these kind of shows. So one of the things we have to always keep in mind is probability provides a really much more accurate set of information. And in fact, we're right in the middle of a huge experiment, essentially, in probability, in that we are trying to get people to socially distance to reduce the probability that they'll be exposed and the amount of their exposure. And so essentially what we're trying to do is work on the math. But people aren't very good at math, it turns out, and it doesn't really hold very much sway. So on the right, what we have are reported measles cases in the United States by year. It's pretty easy to identify when the measles vaccine was introduced. Okay? But because a small percentage of individuals might have some kind of vaccine injury, and yes, people do have bad reactions to vaccines. I was one of them as a kid. I'm alive. I'm fine. And because of those reactions, people oftentimes will not get their kids vaccinated. And this is a huge problem because a disease like measles, which we had decided was eradicated, has actually come back, which is really unfortunate. But it's those cases of vaccine injury that people focus on. And of course, a lot of things that are called vaccine injury really aren't. Autism is not caused by vaccines. In fact, autism is a prenatal disease, starts before kids are born. So let's put that to rest. Next, I want to talk about what's called the Barnum effect. And again, as we start thinking about what people will believe, and that's really what we're talking about here, is their beliefs. And P.T. Barnum was one of the people who discovered this, which is why it's called the Barnum effect. And this is the phenomenon that occurs when people believe that a personality description applies specifically to them more so than other people, despite the fact that that description is actually filled with information that applies to everyone. These are generic personality descriptions. And so this is how a number of things come up. So when you read your horoscope, I don't mind people reading their horoscope for fun. I mind them basing their lives on it. Mercury in retrograde is not what's making you be an asshole. So let's keep that in mind. These horoscopes are designed so that you can pick and choose which bits about them you believe apply to you, and then you just ignore the rest. So you take the things that apply to you and you ignore everything else and focus only on those that apply to you. Handwriting analysis, another lousy personality test. Now, you can use handwriting analysis to determine whether or not that's your handwriting versus somebody else's handwriting. That's different. But determining your sex drive and trust revealed in your handwriting, no, ma'am. Biorhythms, this is another one. This is a big thing in the 70s. You used to be able to go, both biorhythms and handwriting analysis were a big thing, like at state fairs and the stock show. And you'd go and you'd submit your handwriting analysis, and then they'd stick it in this machine, this big blinky machine that looked like a computer, and then it would spit out your analysis. And it was just picking some random, personality description that it then spits out that you paid $20 for. My aunt used to do it every single year. Same with biorhythms. You would put your hands on this thing, and it would, read your personality based on the bioelectrical impedance, or I don't know, who knows. Again, it was a bunch of bunk. The Enneagram, another good one. People love the Enneagram because they do the exact same thing, is they pick the things that they think are about them and ignore the things that are not. See also the Myers-Briggs type inventory, the MBTI. Terrible personality test. You should never take it. It is essentially snake oil. So that's where I want to finish, is the legal principle called caveat emptor, which means buyer beware. What we think of as sort of modern cures is often snake oil. One of the biggest problems with the supplement market is it is underregulated, and so what you think you might be getting might be completely different. I used to, speaking of people taking snake oil, there was a workout supplement called Ripped Fuel that contained ephedra before it was banned by the federal government. I don't know, some kid had a heart attack. And what I can tell you about that particular supplement is, while yes, it did contain ephedra, you never knew how much ephedra was going to be in whichever pill you might have taken. So one day it wouldn't do anything, and the next day you'd be jumping out of your skin because it had too much ephedra in it. So probably best that it was taken off the market, but you could lose you could just, basically it was all water weight. You could lose 3 pounds in 2 days. That was sort of my modern version of snake oil. This is a great book on the left called Charlatan. This guy used to travel around and plant goat testicles in people as a treatment for everything. They would, of course, get an infection and die. And he was finally hunted down, I think, in China, and they disposed of him in a rather gruesome way, as I recall. But you can read that book. But basically, what I'm trying to get to as I wander my way through concluding up this lecture is you have to be very cautious. Yesterday, the President of the United States wondered out loud whether or not people could drink or inject Lysol and other kinds of antiseptic agents to treat a virus. And so let's use our common sense. That's obviously not a way to treat any virus. So you have to be very cautious, and it doesn't matter who the information is coming from. It's not just coming from official channels, unofficial channels, lots of people spewing out a bunch of bunk. Somebody was on the other day talking about vitamins and COVID-19. It's not vitamins. So we have to really watch out for that, and just use common sense and just try to be skeptical. Never hurts to be skeptical. That's what I have to say. Anyway, everyone stay safe out there and have a great day.